A lonely rancher who had spent 42 years invisible to the world rode into town on Christmas morning and found a half-frozen stranger in an alley, never knowing that saving one forgotten soul would finally teach his own heart how to be found.
Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories. Turn on the bell icon so you can do not miss any new video.
The snow had come early to Cedar Creek that year, blanketing the valley in white silence before December had even properly begun. By Christmas morning, the drifts reached past the fence posts along the main road into town, and most sensible folks stayed indoors by their fires with their families. Thomas Hartwell was not most folk. At 42 years old, he had spent more Christmases alone than he cared to count. The Hartwell Ranch sat 3 miles outside of town, sprawling across 200 acres of prime grazing land that had been in his family for 2 generations. He had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his father, along with the expectation that Thomas would marry, produce sons, and continue the legacy. He had failed at that expectation in every conceivable way. Thomas rode his horse, a sturdy mare named Copper, down the main street of Cedar Creek just as the church bells began their Christmas morning peal. The town looked like something from a painting. Every window glowed with candlelight, wreaths hung on doors, and children's laughter echoed from inside warm houses. He touched the brim of his hat as he passed Mrs. Peterson, who was sweeping fresh snow from her porch, and she nodded back with that particular expression the townspeople reserved for him. Polite distance, careful neutrality. They didn't hate Thomas Hartwell. He was a fair employer, an honest businessman, and he paid his debts on time. But they sensed something different about him, something he had never spoken aloud, and so they kept him at arm's length, and he had learned to accept it. He was heading to the general store, which Emmett Clay kept open even on Christmas morning for those who had last-minute needs. Thomas needed coffee and nails, and the ride into town was better than sitting alone in his empty house, listening to the silence. That was when he saw the boy. The alley between the general store and the blacksmith's shop was narrow and dark, piled with crates and old barrels. Most people walked past without a second glance. But Thomas had spent his life watching cattle for signs of illness, watching weather for signs of storms, watching people because it was safer than being watched. The boy couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. He sat huddled against the back wall of the blacksmith's shop, knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped around himself. His clothes were thin and patched, entirely wrong for a Wyoming winter. His dark hair was too long, hanging over a face that was pale with cold and something else, something that looked like defeat. Thomas pulled Copper to a stop. The church bells had gone quiet. The street was empty. The boy hadn't looked up. He sat perfectly still, and for one terrible moment, Thomas wondered if he was dead. Then the boy shivered, a full-bodied tremor that shook his thin frame, and Thomas dismounted before he had consciously decided to move. His boots crunched in the snow as he approached the alley. The boy's head snapped up at the sound, and Thomas found himself looking into the bluest eyes he had ever seen, blue like summer sky, like cornflowers, like the deep heart of a flame. Those eyes were filled with fear and defiance and exhaustion in equal measure. "Easy now," Thomas said, the same voice he used with spooked horses. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy pressed himself harder against the wall. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just resting." "I didn't say you were doing anything wrong." Thomas crouched down so they were at eye level, keeping a careful distance. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated. His lips were tinged with blue, and Thomas could see the fine trembling in his hands. "Daniel. Daniel Reese. Daniel." Thomas repeated it, and the name felt significant somehow, like a key turning in a lock. "I'm Thomas Hartwell. You from around here?" "No, sir." Daniel's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "I came in on the mail coach 3 days ago, looking for work." 3 days. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. 3 days in that thin coat, in this cold. "You find any?" The silence was answer enough. "You have people here? Family?" Daniel shook his head. The movement was small, almost ashamed. Thomas had lived 42 years as a careful man. He had kept his secrets close, avoided entanglements, protected himself from a world that would not understand him. He had built walls as strong as the ones around his ranch house, and he had never once considered letting someone inside them. But looking at this boy, this young man with sky-blue eyes and a stubborn jaw, sitting in the snow on Christmas morning because he had nowhere else to go, Thomas felt those walls begin to crack. "Can you stand?" he asked. Daniel blinked. "What? I've got a ranch 3 miles from here. I need help with the horses and the cattle and 100 other things. The work is hard, but it's honest, and there's a warm bunkhouse and 3 meals a day." Thomas paused. "That is, if you're interested." The suspicion in Daniel's eyes sharpened. "Why? You don't know me." "No, I don't." Thomas stood and extended his hand. "But I know what it looks like when someone needs help, and I know what it feels like to be invisible." Something flickered across Daniel's face, surprise maybe, or recognition. Slowly, with joints stiff from cold, he reached up and took Thomas's hand. His fingers were like ice, and Thomas resisted the urge to close both his hands around them, to warm them with his own heat. He helped Daniel to his feet, steadying him when he swayed. Up close, Thomas could see more details. The sharp angles of his cheekbones that spoke of missed meals, the proud set of his shoulders despite everything, the way his eyes held a depth that seemed impossible for someone so young. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly. "I won't disappoint you." Thomas believed him. The ride back to the ranch was slow. Thomas had Daniel sit in front of him on copper, wrapped in the spare blanket Thomas always carried in his saddlebag. The boy, the young man, Thomas corrected himself, was light in his arms, and he leaned back against Thomas's chest as the cold and exhaustion caught up with him. By the time they reached the ranch house, Daniel was half asleep. Thomas carried him inside, laid him on the couch by the fireplace, and spent the next hour building up the fire, warming soup, and finding extra blankets. He worked quietly, efficiently, the way he always did, but his thoughts were chaos. What was he doing? What had possessed him to bring a stranger into his home? But he knew, deep down, in the part of himself he had spent decades trying to deny, he knew. Daniel slept through most of Christmas Day. Thomas sat in the chair across from him, pretending to read, watching the color slowly return to Daniel's cheeks. When Daniel finally woke, it was evening, and the fire had burned low to glowing embers. "How long was I asleep?" Daniel asked, his voice rough. "A few hours. You needed it." Thomas closed his book. "How do you feel?" "Better." Daniel pushed himself upright, looking around the room with those observant blue eyes, taking in the worn furniture, the shelves of books, the photograph on the mantel of Thomas's parents on their wedding day. "This is your home?" "It is. It's nice. Quiet." Daniel's gaze returned to Thomas. "Why do you live here alone?" The question was direct in a way that most people weren't with Thomas. It caught him off guard. "Because that's how things worked out." "That's not really an answer." "No," Thomas admitted. "I suppose it's not." They looked at each other across the firelit room, and something passed between them. An understanding that Thomas couldn't name but felt in his bones. Daniel stayed. At first it was just for the winter. Thomas gave him the bunkhouse, showed him the work, paid him fair wages. Daniel learned quickly. He was smart and determined, with a quiet strength that revealed itself gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. But as the weeks passed, something shifted. The distance between them began to close, inch by inch, in ways that Thomas could not ignore. It was the way Daniel looked at him sometimes, when he thought Thomas wasn't watching. It was the way their hands brushed when passing tools, and neither of them pulled away. It was the conversations that stretched late into the night, sitting on the porch despite the cold, talking about everything and nothing. Thomas had never talked to anyone the way he talked to Daniel. He found himself sharing things he had buried for decades, His loneliness, his fears, the truth about why he had never married, never courted the women the town tried to push toward him. "I'm not made that way," he said one night in February, staring at the stars rather than at Daniel's face. "I never have been." The silence stretched long enough that Thomas began to regret speaking. Then Daniel's voice came, soft and certain, "Neither am I." Thomas turned to look at him. Daniel was already looking back, his blue eyes bright in the moonlight, and Thomas understood that he had not been alone in this. He had never been alone in this. He reached out and touched Daniel's face, cupping his jaw with a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed. Daniel leaned into the touch, eyes fluttering closed, and Thomas felt something break open. Inside him, all the years of loneliness and denial and fear, shattering like ice in spring. He kissed Daniel Reese on a cold February night, under a sky full of stars, and for the first time in 42 years, Thomas Hartwell felt like he was finally home. Their love grew slowly, carefully, hidden from a world that would never understand. In public, Daniel was Thomas's ranch hand, his hired help. In private, he was everything. He was the warmth in Thomas's bed, the laughter in Thomas's kitchen, the steady presence that made the silence of the ranch feel like peace instead of loneliness. The townspeople noticed the change in Thomas. He smiled more now. He lingered in town longer, making conversation instead of completing his errands and leaving. Mrs. Peterson remarked to her husband that the Hartwell man seemed less haunted these days, and nobody could figure out why. They didn't need to know. Thomas and Daniel had built their own world within the walls of the ranch, and it was enough, more than enough. But life in the West was never easy, and love, especially their kind of love, was never safe. In autumn, a man came to Cedar Creek asking questions. He was Daniel's father, a hard man with a preacher's righteousness and a drunk's temper, searching for the son who had run away rather than submit to a marriage arranged without his consent. Thomas saw him in town first, heard him asking at the general store about a young man with dark hair and blue eyes. He rode home faster than he ever had, fear like a stone in his chest. Daniel was in the barn when Thomas burst through the doors. He looked up, saw Thomas's face, and understood immediately. "He found me," Daniel said. "It wasn't a question. He's in town. He'll hear about you working here. He'll come." Daniel's face went pale, but his jaw set with that stubborn determination Thomas loved so much. "Then let him see." Daniel, no." Daniel crossed the barn, took Thomas's hands in his own. "I spent 19 years hiding from that man, trying to be what he wanted. I won't do it anymore. I won't leave you. If he takes you, he can try." Daniel's eyes blazed. "But I'm not a boy anymore, and I have something worth fighting for now." Thomas looked at the man Daniel had become, strong, certain, unafraid, and felt his heart swell with pride and love and terror all at once. When Daniel's father arrived at the ranch the next morning, they were waiting for him. Thomas stood on the porch, Daniel beside him, neither of them willing to step back. The confrontation was ugly. Daniel's father raged about duty and sin and shame, about the things he would do to Thomas if he didn't release his son. He threatened the law, the church, the whole fury of righteous society. Thomas said nothing through it all. He simply stood there, solid as the mountains, his hand resting on Daniel's shoulder. Finally, when the old man had exhausted his fury, Thomas spoke. "Your son is a grown man who makes his own choices. He chose to stay here, and he chooses to stay now. You can accept that or you can leave, but you will not threaten him and you will not take him anywhere he doesn't want to go. He's my son. He's my partner." Thomas's voice was quiet but unyielding. "In this ranch and in everything else. And I will protect him with my life if I have to." Something in Thomas's eyes must have convinced the old man that he meant every word. After a long, terrible silence, Daniel's father spat on the ground, called them both names that would have once made Thomas flinch, and rode away. He never came back. That night, Daniel wept in Thomas's arms. Tears of relief and grief and release, all the emotions he had held inside for so long finally breaking free. Thomas held him through it, stroking his ear, whispering promises against his temple. "I've got you," he said. "I've got you, and I'm never letting go." The following Christmas, 1 year after Thomas had found Daniel in that frozen alley, they stood together on the porch of their ranch house and watched the snow fall over the valley. The cattle were fed, the horses were warm in the barn, and the fire crackled inside, waiting for them. "Do you remember what you said?" Daniel asked, leaning into Thomas's side. "That day you found me?" "I said a lot of things that day. You said you knew what it felt like to be invisible." Daniel looked up at him, those blue eyes full of love. "But you saw me. When no one else did, you saw me." Thomas wrapped his arm around Daniel's shoulders, pulling him closer. "How could I not? You're the brightest thing I've ever known." They stood there as the snow fell, two men who had found each other against all odds, who had built something real and precious in a world that would have denied them the chance. They couldn't marry, couldn't declare their love in any way the world would recognize. But they had this home, this land, this life they had made together. And on every Christmas after, Thomas Hartwell would remember the day he rode into town for coffee and nails, and found instead the man who taught him that even the loneliest heart could find its way home.